Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Perkenalkan, nama saya Novel Satria dengan NPM 243510425 dari kelas 4B. Di sini saya ingin melakukan pembelajaran mandiri pertemuan 10 yang dimana mengikuti research yang diberikan oleh Pak Rizky. Baiklah. Nah, kita di sini disuruh mengikuti pembelajaran penggunaan Express.js Crash Course, yang dimana di sini kita akan mengikuti sesuai apa yang ada di video ini.
Then you can also use it. Do you remember what we have in which you want to create
Ini apa? Ya, langsung saja kita membuat file baru. Pada file ini kita mengisi apa beda ya?
project and I name it as task track and simply open this folder in the VS Code. This is the name of our project. Is it sounds good? I hope it is. If you have better name, then you can also use it. It's totally up to you. Now what we have to do for creating Node.js applications? Do you remember? We just did that in our previous section. Yes, simply we open our terminal and initialize our project using npm in terminal and initialize our project using npm init. And for all yes, we will use -y here. See, we get package.json file with some default config. See, we get package.json file with some default config. Here we can see our main file is index.js, which is the file runs when we start our application. So let's JS config. See, we get package.json file with some default config. Here we can see our main file is index.js, which is the file runs when we start our application. So let's create index.js file, and that's it. Here in this file, we will write code for our backend.
Introducing ClickUp Super Agents, the world's first AI agents that natively
for our backend. We create our server using HTTP module.
Ada creating shuffle
And the province also not a popular package minimal and by using HTTP something we can see its weekly downloads are almost 90%. It's very important. Module npm install express. Open up terminal. First of all, let's install this module in our project. So open up express used in 1937 website. We spawns, middlewares and much more things. Let me show you something. Here is the Express package on npm.js website. We can see its weekly downloads are almost 37.2 million, which is crazy. And almost in 90% of Node.js projects, developers use Express package. So it is very important to master Express, right? First of all, let's install this module in our project. So open up terminal and write npm install express. At the time I am recording this course, its latest version is 5.1.0. If you want to get the same experience as I am getting, then you can write here npm and hit enter. Don't worry about express, it is really simple package. Done.
okay.
Now we want to use this express module in this index.js file. Can you tell me what we have to do? Right, we will import the express module using require function express, and this require function returns a function. So we simply store it in variable called express. Now to create an express application, we call this express function here, which returns a object, and we store it in variable called application or app. You can give it any other name, but probably all developers called it app. So let's go with app. Now in this app object, we get many useful methods. For example, we have here app.get, app.post, app.put, app.patch, app.delete, etc. Do you remember where we see these 5 methods? Right, they are HTTP methods for creating different types of API. So if we want to define our API for HTTP GET method, then we use app.get. If we want to define HTTP delete method, then we use app.delete. Same as we can create post, put and patch request. The way to define all these 5 methods are the same. Still, we will see all methods in this section one by one. For now, let's start with get request. So in this get method, at the first parameter, we have to write our API endpoint name. Suppose we want to define get API for URL http localhost 3000 /todos. Now what is our endpoint in this URL? Right here at the first parameter. Make sure we add here /first, otherwise this will not work properly. Now what if we want to define get API for URL http colon double slash localhost colon 3000, which is only forward slash. What will happen is we get two objects, request details about URL request, and with this response object we can send response related details. We already seen these in HTTP on this dot get request simply app 3009.
biar cepat. Buat buat sih. Buat banget sumpah. Teks dia. Bisa lah.
Nice. Now back to browser and run localhost colon 3000 our port number. run when our server started listening on this port. So here we can see on this port index.js 3000. Save the changes and let's run our index.js file. Write node index.js. See, server is listening on this.
Okay.
Port 3000. Nice. Now back to browser and run localhost colon 3000.
Host. Mhm. What?
Which is the root URL, and see, here we get task track project text which we send from our server. You can see Express makes our code really send host colon 3000.
Okay.
Which is the root URL, and see, here we get task track project text which we send from our server. You can see Express makes our code really simple. We can compare our current code with the previous HTTP module code. Express makes it really simple. In that,
Bikin video iklan pakai AI itu udah biasa, tapi gimana jadinya kalau kalian punya AI pribadi yang bisa
now let's create API for getting all to-dos list. Can you tell me which HTTP method we have to use? Get method. So here we write app.get and let's
Get.
say we want to give this API name to-dos. So we pass here /to-dos, and after that at the second parameter we pass callback function which has two parameters, request and response. See, for all APIs this structure will stay the same, only this HTTP method change, this endpoint change, and logic inside this callback function will change. That's how Express.js makes our project simple and clean. Now currently we are not going to work with the database because we don't want to add extra complexity for don't worry about data. At the top we add some to-dos in this. So here every to-do and at the top I define one dummy data called to-dos array and simply add some to-dos in this. So here every to-do is object with 4 properties. ID, let's set it to 1 and simply add some to-dos in this. So here every to-do is object with 4 properties. ID, let's set it to 1. Task, which is the text of task, let's say create all APIs for project 1. Tags, which are the tags related to task, which is an array, Node.js, comma, JavaScript, and status to do. These properties ID, task, tags, status is defined by Node.js developer, which means you. What you want to call it, how many properties you need, these things you have to decide based on which data we want to store and which data we don't want. Now let's duplicate this object 2 more times using Shift plus Alt plus down arrow or Shift plus Option plus down arrow. Now we change this ID to 2. Task to create API for list of all to-dos. Tags Node.js and status to doing. And at last, we simply change ID to 3, task to plan project 1, tags, JavaScript, and status to done. Now we want to simply return this array as a response when someone sends GET request to API with /todos endpoint. So what we write request on to script and status to done. Now we want to simply return this array as a response when someone sends GET request to API with /todos endpoint. So what we write here? We write response.send and simply pass our to-dos array. Save the changes and let's verify this API is working or not. Open terminal, close the current running server, save. Open terminal, close the current running server using Ctrl+C and again run this file. Server. Save the changes and let's verify this API is working or not. Open terminal, close the current running server using Ctrl+C and again run this file. Now in the browser, at the and again run this file. Now in the browser, at the place of root and again close the current API is working or not. Open terminal, close the current running server using Ctrl+C and again run this file. Now in the browser, at the place of and again run this file. Now in the browser, Ctrl+ open terminal, verify this API is working or not. Open terminal, close the current running server using Ctrl+C and again run this file. Now in the browser,
Berapa kali? Benar. Sebagai realitas.
at the place of root website, we simply call /todos endpoint and again run this file. Now in the browser, at the place of root website, we simply call /todos endpoint. See, here we get our array. So that's how simple.
Kurang telekom ya. Iya. Tapi sebenarnya oh iya lagi.
To send the place of and again we simply call /todos endpoint. See, here we get our array. So that's how simple to send data from the backend using GET API.
Oh iya. Okay.
Now currently, when we do some change in our project, we have to close our previous running server and restart our application, which is really annoying. So for automatically restart our application, we have one package called nodemon. It is really useful. So open up terminal and write npm install or
CLS.
i-g nodemon Here we use dash
npm
G for installing this nodemon package globally. Otherwise, we have to install nodemon in global package for system password. Now how can we run file using nodemon? Let me show you. So in the terminal, previously we are running file using node index.js. Now for nodemon, we write nodemon index.js. Simple as that. See, here we get our nodemon version, and for restarting, we can enter I using node index.js. Now for nodemon, we write nodemon index.js. Simple as that. See, here we get our nodemon version, and for restarting, we can enter rs. Also, it is telling us watching path period, which means root of this project. After that, it is watching extensions like JS, MJS, CJS, JSON, etc. So any file which have this type of extensions, nodemon is constantly watching those files, and if some end will automatically. Now currently we are
environment env variables.
Now currently we are manually setting the port of our server, but in the real world that port is set by environment in which our application is running. Specifically, it's managed by the hosting provider or development platform. When we deploy we already our port, we will check variable our hardware before we listen our server. We create a variable called port equals to. Now here, how can we check our server has port in its environment or not? So for that, we have one object called process.env. This env is for environment. In this environment, we get all variables which are set by hosting platforms, and .port for port variable. So if any hosting platform want to set different port, then they will store them in this process.env.port variable. That's common convention. Also, all environment variable name is all capital letters and port. So now if but port value 2 times, we pass our port, which is 3000. Now let's pass this port variable at the place of this hard-coded port, and also we will change this console message. Let's make this string as template string using backticks, because in template string
Tahu nih tombol apaan. Oh, udah bener berarti.
we can easily access variable and change this 3000 with or return. Now let's pass this port variable at the place of this hard-coded port, and also we will change this console message. Let's make this string as template string using backticks, because in template strings we can easily access variable and change this 3000 with dollar curly brackets port. So if this environment port is available, then we use it, or if it is false or null, then we use this 3000 port. Simple as that. Currently, in our application, environment port is not set. That's why our application will run continuously on port 3000. Don't worry if you are little confused about this process.env. We will see it in details in the upcoming projects. Now let me give you one shortcut for setting up Node application. First, required express, create express application, create this port variable using this expression and listening the express application on the port. These four things will stay the same in all Node applications. Yes, we can add more functionality in other lines, but nothing will change in these four lines. Previously, we created API for getting the list of all to-dos in our application. But what if we need to get the information about only single to-do, like to-do with ID 1 or ID 3? For that, we need to pass ID in API URL. So our API URL look like this, slash to-dos slash 1, which means we want to fetch one to-do information whose ID is 1. This type of variable which we pass in our URL is called as route parameter, and it is very important for providing the specific information about API request like ID, status, date, anything. Let me show you how we can set this type of API URL and access the route parameters. So we add new get API and endpoint to slash to-dos slash. Now here for defining route parameter, we use colon and give our route variable name like ID. So this ID is our route parameter. We can call it anything like to do ID, but ID is short and sweet, so we go with ID. And that's it. That's how we can define route parameter in our API URL. Now let's access this route parameter in our API logic. Again, we add here callback function with two parameters, request and response. Now inside this function, what do you think? In which object we get information about our route parameter, request or response? Right, we get information about route parameter in request. So request.params. In this params object, we will get all route parameters and we can access it by .id. See, here we get also auto suggestions. Now let's simply send this id in our response.send. Save the changes and back to our browser. Head over to localhost colon is and back to our browser. Response.send. Save the changes and back to our browser. Head over to localhost colon 3000 slash todos slash 1 and see, here we get id 1. So we are successfully getting the route parameter. Now here is the one thing, we can also pass multiple route parameters in our API. For example, we can pass task status to do. Now in the backend, we add here route parameter. And how can we do that? Right, we add slash colon status. And how can we access route parameter? Right, we use request.params.status. Let me show you whole route params object. Save the changes and back to browser. We pass here status value after our id value. Make sure the order is the same as we defined in our API, which means first id and then status. See, here we get the params object with those two properties which we defined in API. Now you might have curiosity, what if we don't pass here status? Let's also see that. Remove the status value and see, here we get cannot get slash todos slash 1, which means our server didn't found API with this URL. So if we define route parameters in our API, then make sure we will pass all route parameters in right order. Now there is another way to pass data in URL, which is by using query parameters and then pass some types of variables like short or ascending, etc. URL. Both are used to pass data in between route parameters, simple words. It will give us error that API not found. But if we don't pass these variables after the question mark parameter API or query parameter, we have another object in request which is request.query. And that's it. We don't need to do anything in our endpoint. Save the changes and take a look. See, here we get the query object. So request is API. So for that, what we'll use, we remove this slash status from our endpoint, we don't need it, and in the callback function, we need to return the single to do which id is the same as our route parameter id. First of all, let's store the route parameter in separate variable. So const to do id equals to, how can we access route parameters? Right, request.params.id. Now we have to find the single to do from our to-dos array which id is same as this to do id. For that, we use one Java which .id. Right, request.params separate route parameters from our endpoint, we don't need it, and in the callback function, we use from our endpoint, we don't need it, and in the callback function, we need to return the single to do which id is the same as our route parameter id. First of all, let's store the route parameter in separate variable. So const to do id equals to, how can we access route parameters? Right, request.params.id. Now we have to find the single to do from our to-dos array which id is same as this to do id. For that, we use one JavaScript array method which is find. So to-dos array dot find, and inside this find method we pass callback function, and here in the parameter we get the single to do object as t. So this t is this single object in the to-dos array. So this t is this single object in the to-dos array, and we return here condition if t.id equals to our to-do id. If you don't know this find method, then let me explain you in short, because it is pure JavaScript concept. So this find method will check our to-dos array, and first it will pick the first object, and we check the condition, then this find method to do, and also if this condition is not satisfied, then it will set t as next object and then again check the condition. And that's how we can find single to do using this find method. Let's also send this to do in response.send method. Save the changes and take a look. Let's remove these query parameters and also status value. And here we don't get anything. Why? We pass id 1, and in our to-dos array, we also have to do with id 1. Then what changes and refresh the page, this single to do. Save the changes and refresh the page on browser. Save the changes and refresh the page on browser. Now in our VS Code terminal where we are running our server, we get our consoles. See, here we get undefined. So we cannot find to do from our to-dos array, and that's the error. May this error occur because we are not comparing the IDs properly. Let's also try to console this to-do ID type using type of to-do ID. This will return the type of to-do ID. Save the changes. And refresh the page. Type of using type of to-do ID. This will return the type of to-do ID. Save the changes and refresh the page using type of to-do ID. This will return the type of to-do ID. Save the changes and refresh the page. Back to VS Code and see, here we get undefined for single to-do and we get type string for to-do ID. And that's why we are not getting single to-do because here our to-do ID is integer and we are comparing it with the string. So we have to convert this to-do ID string into integer. So we can wrap this request.params.id with parse integer. This parse integer function will convert our string into integer. Save the changes and take a look. Refresh the page and see, here we get the single to do and take a look. Refresh the page and see, here we get the single to do object with ID 1. If we pass here ID 3, then we get here to do with ID 3. So it's working. Good. Now you might ask, in the route parameter, we are passing 1 as integer, but why in the backend we get it as a string? So the truth is, whatever we pass in the URL, it is passed as string. So if we want to pass something as integer, then we have to convert it in the backend. We can't pass integer value using route parameter, and it is also true for query parameters. So always remember, when you define route parameters or query parameters, then you have to convert its value using parse integer or parse float method. I intentionally create this error to show you what might happen when we create API and access ID in the route parameter.
Nah, sepertinya hanya itu saja pembelajaran mandiri saya mengenai dari Express.js ini yang dimana kita bisa menyimpulkan dalam penggunaan Express.js ini dia lebih lebih gampang dalam melakukan penglihatan atau kayak untuk ngecek itu dia lebih gampang daripada menggunakan HTML dan sebagainya. Nah, jadi dari apa yang sudah kita lihat tadi, kita sudah belajar dalam penggunaan Express.js, mendownload segala macam, maksudnya kayak melakukan melihat server ke web, bisa dicek langsung, melakukan instalasi dan melakukan konsol, uh, intinya kayak kita bisa melihat langsung lah servernya itu di web dari apa yang telah kita pelajari. Nah, oleh karena itu di sini ingin saya akhiri pembelajaran mandiri saya mengenai Express.js karena mungkin sisanya akan saya pelajari sendiri uh, dalam penggunaan Express.js ini. Oke, seperti yang bisa kita lihat. Namun sebelum saya tutup nih, seperti yang bisa kita lihat, dalam penggunaan Express.js kita bisa mengambil ID 1 dalam apa yang telah kita buat tadi, dan dia akan ngeprint untuk ke dalam servernya. Dan ini, nah mungkin jika kita ingin melakukan 2 juga bisa. Nah, ini juga dia akan menampilkan ID kedua, dan jika kita menampilkan ID 3, dia juga akan menampilkan ID ketiga. Nah, seperti ini. Dan ini adalah yang mungkin akan saya coba nanti dalam pembelajaran mandiri dalam penggunaan Express.js, dimana dia di sini juga menunjukkan penggunaan API, REST API, dan metode HTTP menggunakan get, post, put, fetch, dan delete. Nah, di sini juga menunjukkan dalam pembuatan create Express server menggunakan template API, membuat todo seperti yang kita buat tadi. Ini kita pelajari tadi. Nah, ini adalah cara mendapatkan todonya. Nah, ini yang kita lakukan, melakukan instalasi Node dan memulai aplikasi Node-nya menggunakan Node. Saya melakukan memulai aplikasi Node menggunakan Node. Dan ini mungkin versi yang lebih di atasnya lagi, mungkin yang akan saya coba juga lebih tepatnya ini yang akan saya coba karena ini kan sudah kita coba tadi ya. Nah, baiklah, sekian dari saya tutup. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.